Welcome to A Century of Service, Stories of Alberta's Military History. In particular today we're at the Lethbridge Military Museum. My name is Ian Parkinson and I'm here today with Warrant Officer Retired Glenn Miller. Welcome, Glenn.
Hello.
So how did you wind up in the military?
I ended up through an influence growing up. My mother remarried a military fellow, and so he was stationed in West Germany. So as a family at that time, the families were able to go. I spent 4 years in cadets, and that was a large influence of how I ended up as a full-time job, joining right out of high school.
So how was your experience as a cadet Canadian in Germany?
It was actually really unique because we were the only cadet corps outside of Canada. But so a lot of cadets across Canada strive to go to Europe for the summer. We strive to come back to Canada and to attend different courses or to instruct.
Did you have any particularly poignant memories of your time as a cadet?
Well, as a cadet, to be able to learn a lot, not just about our own sponsor, which was the Royal Canadian Dragoons, which is tanks, but all the people within our cadet corps had some kind of connection throughout the whole brigade. So we would have someone's dad would be a helicopter pilot. So one weekend we were able to jump into helicopters and go riding with them. The brigade commander's son would go on a conference, so we'd be able to hitch a ride with his plane. While he went off to the conference, we would do some kind of professional development. So we got a chance to see Europe in a very unique way under a military microscope that really helped bring history to life. As we read about it, we could get on a bus and go see it as well and experience it.
Okay, so how long were you in the cadets?
4 years.
4 years.
Yeah.
So then when did you come to Canada?
1981, and then I joined the military shortly thereafter in 1982.
What happened from there?
Well, from there, 25 years goes by in a blink of an eye. As a career, you always try to look at some of the things that you want to do, and you try to shape your career to be able to do it. Sometimes it's a matter of being in the right place at the right time. In some ways, I wanted to go back to Europe, and they'd always ask for a single soldier to volunteer.
Right.
And somehow, a married couple would always go instead. And so I was trying to figure out how that worked. But I come to find out many years later, I was one of the top instructors within the unit. They just didn't want to lose me. So in some ways, I had a good carrot in front of me, but I was being penalized for being too good.
No good deed goes unpunished.
Yes, but I did get to go to Europe, and as I was the #1 person to be promoted to the rank of sergeant, as soon as I got to Europe, I was back in Canada on a course to become a sergeant. So
your initial recruitment, which arm of the service did you select?
I wanted to select through the influence of cadets armored. However, there was no vacancies. So the recruiter said, well, there's other trades that use tracked vehicles, and so the guns were available, and artillery was the one that was selected.
And where did you go from there?
From there, I went to Shiloh, Manitoba, and I spent 5 years there, and then I got to finally get to go to Europe, and I spent 4 years there.
And then what happened to your career at that point? You're obviously now an artilleryman.
Right. Well, as an artilleryman, funny enough, for the first Gulf War, I was doing the role of infantry. We were short some people, so we actually had to protect a NATO supply depot, okay. And it was all artillery people doing that job. So we were basically infantry for that time period. And as we were leading up to the Gulf War, the diplomats obviously want to make sure there's no war to be had. So we were in position for a number of months, and then the war hadn't started, so we got a chance to go back to our home base. And that same night is when the cruise missiles started flying. And so we had to gather up all our troops and go back and do our job.
Now, the cruise missiles we'll get to later on, because they're also part of your artillery background. But you've also been deployed in other task forces in your, what 35 years with the artillery. So where else have you been in the world?
Most of it was in Canada. I did 4 years in Baden-Baden and also a tour in Bosnia. And so with the former Yugoslavia, that was almost 7 months. And that was working with the Joint Military Affairs Branch in the Multinational Division headquarters.
Right.
Because of my military training as a warrant officer, assistant instructor in gunnery, which served me very well in the variety of different things that came up during my particular tour.
So what other, you were also involved in enforcing the Dayton Accord.
As part of the tour in Bosnia, my particular job as the desk officer was to approve any movement of weapons, ammunition, or people, primarily in the northwest section of the country in the Serbian military. So if they wanted to simply train their own people, move a number of troops from point A to B and with these weapons, I had to kind of give permission to follow within a matrix.
Yep.
If they wanted to move a tank from A to B, that matrix would call for some physical supervision. NATO wanted to make sure a tank that left position A actually got to position B in accordance with their request versus it didn't get lost along the way.
Now, we also spoke earlier that you were also responsible for inspecting ordnance factories.
Yes, I had roughly 100 different weapon sites, government ordnance factories, and ammunition bunkers, all scattered throughout my section of the country. And so that involved a number of physical inspections based on the inventory that we had, and we actually would make sure that they had their 3,000 missiles or 10,000 landmines, whatever, to make sure that stuff didn't go astray.
Yeah, it's always stock taking. So you've done Bosnia, you've done the Gulf War. What happens next?
Well, I actually had come back to Canada, did recruiting, and that was before Bosnia. And then after I finished recruiting in Toronto, I got posted to Lethbridge, Alberta, and having traveled across Canada, many different spots of this great nation, I never heard of Lethbridge. So I had to look it up on a map. I knew Edmonton, Calgary, Wainwright, Cold Lake, Medicine Hat, Suffield. Never heard of Lethbridge. So at that time, as part of the Cold War dividend, the air defense withdrew from Europe, and so the regular forces were scattered in 3 particular units, Petawawa, Lethbridge, and Valcartier. So I was part of the regular force staff of about 45 people here to train the reservists in the air defense, short-range air defense role.
And how was that? I mean, you've now moved from being a full-time artilleryman / air defense, and now you're training
part-time. So we were always full-time, and part of our role was to provide a troop for the brigade, which is full-time. So we will always be doing that, and we try to train the reserves in order to train themselves.
Yeah.
But that traditionally, any reserve unit across Canada only has a couple regular force cadre to help them train. Ours was unique in that we had 40, so we had a lot more manpower to do a lot more things. One of the things I did in operations and training was to help plan for some of their training in Europe, adventure training in Canada and Europe. And so many of the reservists got a chance to go over and see different battle sites that they would probably not otherwise get to see.
Okay, I'm going to get to your involvement with the Lethbridge Military Museum in a few minutes, but I'd like you to speak to the Silver Cross Mother's Ribbon that you have on your blazer.
Sure.
Could you explain to our viewers exactly what that's about and how you came to be involved?
That's part of Canada's honours and awards system. Any military member after World War I that was killed, their next of kin would get a memorial cross, which is made out of silver. So during the Legion's Remembrance Day service every year, audience members would probably hear that representing the Silver Cross Mothers is a particular person. And the term Silver Cross is because that memorial cross is made out of silver. And at that time, there was only one medal issued. Up until recently, the Canadian Forces then allows the military personnel to have up to 3. And it's up to that person to decide who gets it, whether it's mom, dad, and the first wife, or the second wife, or my firstborn. Veterans Affairs Canada recently came out with 5 additional miniature versions with this purple ribbon. And the purple was selected because the initial memorial cross had a purple ribbon that was suspended around the neck, and that's how the person, the recipient, would wear it. Now it's issued without a ribbon. It's just a bar that gets attached over here.
Okay, and how did you come into possession of this one?
This was given to me by a family of a local veteran, World War II and Korea veteran, Donald Dalkey. And so the family had given some to their children, but they also gave it to some of their friends. And I was honored to have this presented to me on behalf of the family.
It's a special award.
Yeah.
Good for you. So now you're part of the Reg Force cadre here at Lethbridge 28th Field Artillery. You're teaching young reservists air defence. How did you get involved in the museum?
Well, the museum, it comes down to the local history of any unit. Based on a person when they first join a unit, it's imparted upon them, part of their own heritage and history. So part of that history here within Lethbridge, the name of the artillery units has changed a variety of different ways. 18th Field Regiment, Field Battery, self-propelled, depending on the type of weapons. And I came here just after it was renamed and the role changed to Air Defence. So it's the 18th Air Defence Regiment, and now it's called the 20th Independent Field Battery. And again, reflective of the role that particular unit does. So when I came here, I was involved with the training of it, and not only training the reserves, but I also had to train the full-time staff here too, and maintain progression for their careers as well, which is somewhat of a challenge when they don't have the full support of a brigade on the same base. Travel, distance, and time was challenging, so we couldn't necessarily form those relationships of the subunits that we would normally go and protect, like the infantry or armored. And when you're at a base, you get to have those relationships. Here, you see them on exercise only.
So how did you get involved in the museum?
So I got involved with the museum first by walking in this very room and seeing a large bass drum, which had an infantry name on it. And now I know this is an artillery unit, and to show you my level of not understanding, so what is that doing in here? So I've come to learn some of the background history of the Lethbridge area. So my involvement initially actually was involving moving it from A to B in different offices, and at that time the collection of artifacts and war souvenirs was basically in boxes. And so we would need room in one area, so I just tasked some of my soldiers to take those 6 boxes and move them down the hall to that room. And so that went on for a number of years and a number of moves. And then the Lethbridge Military Museum, to be able to impart a professional story, the Senate Association was created, and part of that they wanted to create this museum in cooperation with the commanding officer. And so we wanted to be able to tell that story here. That's why I became involved, because of my history here. And I had a chance as a hobby to do military history when I first got here. I had, again, it comes back to the history. Because I was recruiting, that was my first job in the unit here. So I'd be down in the malls, and some of the World War II veterans, it seemed like quite a lot of them would come up and say, I'm in the artillery. I just didn't fully appreciate or realize how much of an artillery presence was here from Lethbridge, because Lethbridge is an artillery town.
Yes.
So I kind of regret not following up on some of the conversations I met with some of these older veterans. However, I've had the pleasure and honor of speaking to a lot of the wives since. So I'm getting the wives' perspectives. Ideally, I like to get both, but I also have the opportunity to get the prisoners, or not the prisoner of war, the war bride's perspective.
Right.
So that was how I got involved in the Military Museum, helping out the commanding officer at the time. He, Major Chris Kilford, had wrote a book, Lethbridge at War, so I was able to contribute some of that information to him.
Now, the museum itself has a specific artillery display. Can you speak to that display?
You bet. There's three major displays dealing with the artillery, primarily the formation of the artillery, World War I and World War II, and the current form in between. So the artillery was first created in Alberta in 1908 by a local dentist. The commander for the artillery was chosen, and all his officers were also chosen for him at a little meeting. And he said, I'd rather choose my own officers, but before he could even do that, it was agreed that he would have to become qualified as a major, and that was a local dentist by the name of Dr. John Smith Stewart, who also was a veteran of the Boer War, and he had served under Colonel Sam Steele, who was at that time the militia commander for the province of Alberta. So he went to Kingston, got qualified, and then he was able to select his own officers. They had to go, of course, go get qualified in Kingston, and then the unit started growing from there.
What kind of guns did they have at that time?
12 pounders and 13 pounders primarily. And then as World War I got along, there's only so much equipment in Canada in the war effort. So when World War I came along, Major Stewart offered to, everyone wanted to contribute to the war effort. And of course the war is supposed to be over for Christmas, so everyone wanted to get in on the action. A telegram came back, however, that we don't want the whole unit. We're only authorized to recruit a division worth. But we'll take one officer and a draft of 25 guys. So the draft went to Ottawa and they were redistributed to another unit. So that was the first presence of the artillery in World War I. Okay. Shortly thereafter, authorization came for Major Stewart to create an artillery from Lethbridge, and it was the 20th Battery. Mm-hmm. And he was the first commanding officer. As part of that, at that time there were 4 guns in the artillery in a battery. So he actually went up to Edmonton and he recruited some enough people to operate a gun from the Edmonton area. The second in command, Major Ripley, went to Calgary. And again, he got some people from the Calgary area to man one of the other guns. And the other 2 guns were manned by those people already trained here in the Lethbridge. So the 20th Battery was truly the first Alberta unit, artillery, headquartered here in Lethbridge.
A lot of history.
A lot of history. And it just kept building from there. That was the first unit. The 39th Battery was created, followed by the 61st. And afterwards, the 78th Overseas Depot Battery, they didn't go over as a foreign formation, but their job primarily at that time, as the war went on, a lot of the manpower was gone. They would train artillery people in general terms, right. And if the message came, we'll take a draft of 26 guys or 43, they would fill that order and send those people towards the war effort as re-emplacements.
Okay, what happened during the intervening period between the First and Second World Wars for Lethbridge Artillery?
Like any other military unit across Canada, immediately post-war, a lot of downsizing took place. So of the 4 batteries of Lethbridge, it was decided only 2 would stay in Lethbridge, the 20th and 39th. And so that left the 61st and 78th without any certainty. But that did create some certainty for them, because they then later on moved up to Edmonton and Red Deer, and that's where they are today. So there's a bit of a legacy of Alberta history up there as well.
Depth.
And then at the beginning of the Depression, it was harder to get people in the military. Of course, many of them had just fought in the Great War for civilization, yeah. So they knew exactly what they were getting into. So when he went away for summer camp, a lot of them didn't join the military. So one of the ways to revitalize the militia was to kind of base it around some sports as well. So it was a sports competition in the summer, and that kind of helped increase some of the numbers that were otherwise lacking, yeah. In people joining.
So then, what was Lethbridge's artillery involvement in the Second World War?
Well, similar to the first, the 20th Battery was the first unit that was formed. And interesting enough, that was the first unit in Alberta that officers were issued service numbers. In the First World War, officers did not have service numbers. They were known as Lieutenant John Smith. So now the 39th Battery formed part of the 20th Battery formed part of the 2nd Anti-Tank Regiment. So each militia district across Canada was assigned a letter before the service numbers. So in the province of Alberta, the militia district number 13, which consists of the whole province, had the letter M before a service number. So the 20th Battery, the first number up to the 7th number, were reserved for the officers. Mm. And M8 was actually for the first Sergeant Major, George Shirley.
Interesting. So what kind of involvement did the 20th have in the Second World War?
They were primarily an anti-tank unit. And they would start off with the smaller guns. In fact, the 108th Battery, which would later go on to form part of the 2nd Anti-Tank Regiment, trained here in Lethbridge for a number of months before going to Shiloh, Manitoba, and trained there with a battery out of Regina and a battery out of Calgary, which formed the 2nd Anti-Tank Regiment. And they went through a variety of different guns as the war progressed.
So your artillery ancestors have seen a lot of iterations of equipment.
Absolutely. The 39th battery was a filled battery, went out to BC to start with. The 112th battery is a new role now in Lethbridge as anti-aircraft. And they would go on later on in the war to be the only artillery unit to fire rockets in World War II.
So after the end of World War II, the guys have come home, we've gone through our usual reorganization and downsizing. What happened to the 28th at that time?
Well, the batteries, as you said, a lot of reorganization took place and downsizing. They also had a battery out in Fort McLeod, the 93rd battery. So they're still evolving in whatever the circumstances and economics allowed at the time.
Yep.
There's also people that went and volunteered for the Korea War shortly after World War II ended. And so that contribution was still made at that time.
So the Canadians had artillery involvement in Korea?
Yes. And Don Dalkey, who was in that conflict as well, or in what we call the Korean War today.
Right. So then, after Korea, you yourself have served in Germany and in the Gulf Wars. What other deployments has this regiment seen?
Well, this regiment hasn't seen anything as a formed unit since World War II. However, the primary role of any militia unit is to augment the regular forces, and so this unit has sent off over time individual augmentees to help with the regular forces in Africa, Europe, Afghanistan, and that's what its primary job is, to assist with. So we've had some people, in fact, as part of the evolution of the reserves, one of the officers here was actually in charge of the regular force for a change. And normally it's a regular force officer in charge of a regular force unit. He was a reservist in charge of a regular force unit, and that was over in Cyprus. So that just speaks to the volume of the evolution of the contributions from Lethbridge.
Right. You and I spoke earlier. You're now heavily involved in a fundraising activity for your legacy of Alberta.
Yes, what we're trying to do is recognize that Lethbridge is an artillery town. Most armories across Canada are visible within their own communities. However, in Lethbridge, we're kind of on the outskirts of the city. When I first was posted here, wearing my uniform to work, people thought I was visiting from Calgary or Edmonton. So it goes to show over 100 years ago, we've had a Lethbridge artillery presence, but the average person today doesn't know the presence that's out here today. They don't know the name of the unit or the name of the armory or the name of the commanding officer. So this is helping to promote that. And so we're also recognizing that Lethbridge, the 39th Battery in the First World War, had the distinction of firing the last shot of World War I.
So if somebody wants to be involved in this fundraising program for your legacy, how can they get a hold of you? Or where would they go to get more information?
They go onto the website. This is not with the Lethbridge Military Museum. This is through the Lethbridge United Services Institute. Right. But it just helps to tell the overall heritage and history of Southern Alberta.
Is there anything else you'd like to share about your history? Any amusing experiences?
Well, I'd like to share the father of artillery in Alberta, Brigadier General John Smith Stewart, had the distinction of being in charge of the parade on November 11th, 1918. And he also had the great fortune of attending the 50th anniversary of the commemoration in Mons 50 years later.
Wow.
But today, the unit here, when I was in the unit as part of the regular force, it didn't really have a lot of depth to it. And this unit, since the regular force have left, like any other reserve unit, it's been known within the 41 Brigade here in Alberta to punch above its weight, and it's done a lot of great recruiting.
Yep. And
the numbers speak volumes as to the success of the contribution of all the local citizens, whether they be a teacher, a plumber, or a professor. The citizen soldier is the big story to take away from the community here, because that is what we're trying to capture here in the Military Museum, is the human interest stories. And there's lots of artillery heritage and history out there that we don't know about. And so I would encourage your viewers to be able to contact the museum and share what they have. Sometimes they have something they got from their relatives from the war or in their travels through military circles. They just don't know what it is.
Yep.
And so we may be able to help and identify what that object is, and they can then overlap on top of that a story which brings that object to life.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Glenn.
Well, thank you.
It's been a very interesting conversation. This has been another episode of Century of Service. Thank you for watching.